John 5 and 17. Negation or clarification of the Sabbath. John chapter 4 verse 34. Jesus said unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work. To distinguish between the works of the Father and those of the Son would mean to destroy the absolute unity between the two, a unity which is emphatically taught in John's Gospel. What then is the working until now of the Father? Could it refer to God's continua for the maintenance of the universe which knows no interpretation on the Sabbath? The orthodoxy of such a notion can hardly be disputed. But is this the Johannine understanding of the divine working? In the Gospel of John, the working and works of God are repeatedly and explicitly identified with the saving mission of Christ. John 4 and verse 34. That Christ's mission is to do and to complete his God's work. In John 6 and 29, the purpose of the work of God is spelled out as being that you believe in whom he has sent. Again, in John 10:37 to 38, Christ not only claims to be doing the works of his Father, but also urges his listeners to believe the works. John 14:11, John 15:24. The redemptive nature and purpose of the working until now of the Father and Son is possibly suggested also by the setting for the healing of the paralytic, namely the pool of Bethsaida, which means place of mercy. Any lingering doubt is removed by the strikingly similar episode of the healing of the blind man. Not only is the Father described here as the one who sent the Son to do his work, thus implying the missionary character of Christ's activity, but the very healing of the blind man is described as the manifestation of the works of God. John chapter 9 and verse 3. These indications force the conclusion that the working until now of the Father in John 5 verse 17 refers not to a cura continua, but rather to acta salutis, the works of salvation, accomplished by the Father through the Son. Speaking with qualification as well, there is but one work of God, that is the mission of the Son in the world. Theological implications of the passage. What are the theological implications of the redemptive nature of the Sabbath working of the Father and of the Son? Does Christ's defense of his Sabbath healing on the grounds of God's works of salvation, which continue after the creation Sabbath, imply that as by his redemptive work Jesus set aside the Sabbath? Did Christ, through his saving ministry, as argued, bring to an end this feast day, the Sabbath, by fulfilling the ultimate purpose underlying God's institution of this Old Testament of this day in the Old Testament? Does the saying, my Father is working until now, imply a movement in redemptive history from promise to fulfillment? That is to say, from the promise of the Old Testament Sabbath rest to the fulfillment found in the day of the resurrection? In other words, did the fourth evangelist report Christ saying, as claimed to justify on the one hand the superseding of the Jewish Sabbath by the new conception of the divine rest, and to defend on the other hand the observance of the Lord's Day, Sunday, of the Christian community? To assume that through his Sabbath deed and pronouncement, Christ was announcing, though in a veiled fashion, the end of the Sabbath observance, which was soon to be replaced by Sunday observance, is to hold the same position as those Jews who accused Christ of Sabbath breaking. John chapter 5 and 16 and 18. John chapter 9 and 16. But this is the very charge that Christ consistently refused to admit. It must be emphasized that Jesus, in this as well as in all his other Sabbath deeds, never conceded any transgression of the Sabbath, but rather defended the legality of his actions by a theological norm admitted by his opponents. A defense implies not an admission, but a refutation of the accusation. To understand the force of Christ's defense in John, one needs to remember that the Sabbath is linked both to the cosmos through creation, Genesis chapter 2, Exodus 20, and to redemption through the Exodus, Deuteronomy 5 and 15. By interrupting all secular activities, the Israelite was remembering the Creator God, and by acting mercifully toward fellow beings, he was imitating the Redeemer God. This was true not only in the lives of the people who on the Sabbath were to be compassionate toward the lower orders of the society, but particularly in the service of the temple. There on the Sabbath, the priests performed many common works which were forbidden for the Israelites. For instance, while on the Sabbath no baking was to be done in the home, Exodus 16 and 23, yet in the temple bread was baked on that day for the cereal offering of the high priest, and apparently also to replace the week-old bread of the presence. 1 Samuel 21 verses 3 to 6, Leviticus 24 verse 8, 1 Chronicles 9 and 32. Moreover, on the Sabbath, the sacrificial offerings were augmented by doubling them. Numbers 28, 9 and 10. Accordingly, in Matthew, Christ utilized the latter argument to defend the legality of his Sabbath acts as well as those of his disciples, when he said, "Have ye not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless?" Matthew 25 verse 12 and 25. 12 and verse 5. Why are the priests guiltless, though working more intensely on the Sabbath? The answer lies in the redemptive nature of their work, which was not prescribed but contemplated by the Torah. Christ claims the same prerogative for himself, since he is greater than the temple. As the true high priest, Jesus also has the right to intensify on the Sabbath his ministry of salvation on behalf of needy sinners. And what he does, his followers, the new priesthood, must do likewise. John 9 and verse 4.